So welcome back to Roy on Rescue. We've had a couple of emails come in that I really want to address quickly in the time we have remaining before the holidays. And one was a follow-up question to what to do in case of an impaled object that might be getting in the way of doing CPR. And really, there's two different sides of this. One is from the layperson standpoint, and the other is from the standpoint of emergency medicine at a licensure level. And regardless of either one of those, you're really trying to not remove the impaled object if you don't have to. Remember, when it goes in, it makes a hole. If it stays in, it tends to plug that hole and keep it from excessively bleeding. It's not a great picture like we've mocked up here in case of a stab wound. It's in a bad spot. That's right where I've got to do the chest compressions. Believe it or not, as much as we don't want to move around objects, and it's still going to default to your local protocols, it's going to default to your 911 dispatch center that may actually direct you to do something a bit differently. But if we can actually put our hands around it, we may actually do CPR compressions around the object. Now this is dramatically affixed here, but more realistically, it could be an impaled stick, a stake, a re-rod off a construction site. This could be a domestic violence or some type of violent act, but this is pretty much extreme. And in fact, if I had a stick this long, I would probably shorten it by gloving up, stabilizing the object. And in this case, obviously it's metal, that's gonna be tough, but I'm thinking more if it was a stick, we could cut the stick off and shorten it, try to stabilize around it, and start doing our chest compressions. Now, if 911 dispatch or your medical control were to tell you to actually take the object out, which is not very often, you would do so and rush them priority to the hospital. This person needs to get into surgery anyway, but especially because of this puncture wound. If the object is actually into the cheek or airway, we're going to still try to do the CPR without removing the object because we have bleeding issues. But I guess, you know, in some protocols, if it's in the way and you cannot secure an airway, we remove the object, again defaulting to your local protocol or the 911 dispatch. Now, right on the heels of this, I want to talk about one other question that just came in completely opposite of this question, and that is, what happens if I've had an ankle injury and I'm having problems with it popping in and out or making a popping sound? I'm going on vacation, I don't have a lot of time, what do I do? It's not a very good situation. You're going to have to gauge this by yourself. I'm not an orthopedic surgeon or even a doctor, I'm a paramedic, but from this standpoint, take it for what it's worth. I would call your doctor, get a second opinion on it. If it's an acute injury and you are really having to apply first aid and get yourself through until you get to the hospital or get to a place where you can see somebody, it's still the R.I.C.E.S application. Rest, ice, compression through an ACE bandage wrap to help reduce swelling, and elevation above the heart to keep swelling down as well. You know, talk to your doctor again. If they have any other advice, that may be the thing to follow. Potentially you could brace it. If you notice that it's causing you problem when you're out and about, getting bumped, moving a certain way, there are over-the-counter braces that can be of assistance. But remember, if we self-diagnose, self-treat without really knowing what's going on, we run the risk of an acute injury becoming a long-term injury and causing more problems down the road. Again, if it's popping in and out, it's probably a soft tissue tendon ligament injury. It could even potentially be a fracture or some type of cartilage tear, and that could be serious. So you don't really want to spend a lot of time self-doctoring if it's continuing to hurt. If it is a temporary sprain or strain, rest, ice, compression, elevation, maybe, and I'm not telling you to do this, but over the counter, your doctor may want you to actually take some kind of anti-inflammatory or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication to help with that. Follow directions as the doctor or the drug prescribes it to be taken, and hopefully you can continue your fun time on vacation. I hope this helps. From Roy on Rescue, keep on rescuing. Have a great Thanksgiving. Bye-bye. It is almost Thanksgiving. Do you mind if I
Go ahead.
borrow this? Thanks.
Go ahead.
That'll help with the turkey.
That'll be good.
All right.
You carve me up.